Welcome back to our lecture on immigration, and we begin here with our third wave, also called the New Wave, running from 1880 until 1924. And you can see I included some arrows here that show us different groups than those that we saw in the old wave. We see that at the bottom, Austria-Hungary, Eastern Europe, is beginning to send people to the United States, as is Italy in Southern Europe and Russia in Eastern Europe. We also see at the top of this graphic a smaller group from China is beginning to arrive during the middle of the period. So the new wave introduces immigrant pathways from Southern and Eastern Europe. And while again this might seem pretty mainstream today, this was a culture clash during this period in U.S. history. These groups that arrived, they spoke different languages. So unlike our English immigrants or immigrants from the UK or immigrants from Ireland that spoke English, and our immigrants from Germany that culturally were more similar to those individuals from the UK. These groups had distinct cultures, distinct way of life, speaking different languages. These immigrants were primarily moving to urban locations and coming from urban locations. The population explosion that occurred during this time meant that a lot of our cities in the Northeast and Midwest, places like Chicago, New York, Boston, were two-thirds immigrant or first generation. So this new wave of immigration, bringing people again from Southern and Eastern Europe, led to a population explosion. Now, the pull factor during this time was economic opportunity, industrialization. Coming out of the Civil War, the American economy really boomed through the 1920s. And with this wave, we also saw the establishment of ethnic enclaves. So these voluntary communities that were separated from the community at large. We see here at the end of this wave, there's a tightening. And that reflects policy that occurred during this time, a political reaction to the new wave and the individuals included in it. This image here shows us Locust Point in downtown Baltimore, where Fort McHenry is located. And Locust Point was the second busiest port of entry, the second largest immigration terminal in the United States. And you see this North Bremen line shipping connection that brought individuals from Germany and took them to Baltimore. The image on the right shows us the immigration pier in Baltimore. Many individuals would come into Baltimore and move into the downtown communities, setting up their own ethnic enclaves, while others would jump on the B&O Railroad and head west for places like Chicago and St. Louis. Immigrants also flooded into New York City. As you can see, the pictures here by Jacob Riis showed us what are called 5-cent lodging. So neighborhoods in New York like the Five Points became these immigrant hubs where individuals just off the boat or just off the railroad would go into this neighborhood, and they would start to recreate space. As you can see here, the density of this neighborhood was tremendous. The image on the screen now shows the number of people living in a small 200 square foot apartment. You can see on the left side of the image we have their travel trunks, we have a stove to keep them warm. You can see the bunk beds, so very little space, very congested places. And when individuals live in these type of places, things like disease are more likely to spread. So immigrants coming into the United States get this reputation as being dirty, disease-ridden, poor, really a lot of negative connotations. The new wave continued again until about 1924, 1925. And what caused the end of the era was what's known as the Johnson-Reed Act of 1924. So as xenophobia began to increase, as an anti-immigration rhetoric began to increase, politicians, elected officials began to react to this. The slide at the top of this image shows us how Uncle Sam is cutting off or limiting the amount of Europeans into the United States by creating a funnel. So the Johnson-Reed Act of 1924 established quotas. A quota is a limit. So they looked to reduce the number of immigrants coming in, primarily those immigrants in the new wave, coming from places like Southern and Eastern Europe. The reason why this happened was because this native identity was growing. This idea that a native, strong American identity was at odds with these individuals coming from Southern and Eastern Europe with different cultures, different languages, maybe a darker complexion. So we saw a lot of xenophobic and racist attitudes towards immigration during this time. We also saw a big push by unions to reduce the amount of competition, because a simple supply and demand economics tells us that the bigger the labor force, the lower the wage. So by limiting the amount of competition, labor unions were allowed to increase their rate or increase what they demand for an hourly wage. And we see that some of these ideas, some of these panics, they reoccur at times throughout U.S. history. And we're seeing that a sizable percentage of the U.S. population today is basing their anti-immigration stance on ideas not too far from eugenics, basing their anti-immigration stance on ideas of other people stealing jobs. The graphic on this slide shows us what happened after the Johnson-Reed Act. So you can see that in 1881 to 1890, we still had most of our immigrants coming from Northwestern Europe. But then the blue part of the circle is Southern and Eastern Europe. And you can see from 1890 through 1920 how the large percentage of our immigrants were coming from Southern and Eastern Europe. So what the Johnson-Reed Act did was place quotas, limiting the amount of people coming in. But they did so based on the 1890 census. So in 1890, there were very few Russians, there were very few Austrians, there were very few Italians in the country. So by setting the quota on the 1890 census as opposed to the 1920 census, they were able to legally reduce the number of people coming from parts of the world that were really deemed undesirable by many political parties and by many individuals. So when we look at just one group that was arriving in the new wave, the Italians, we see that their immigration dropped by over 90% as a result of this act. After immigration cut off, we hit a new wave. And this isn't immigration, rather this is migration. So during this period, from World War I through 1970, the United States felt the effects, first off, of the need for labor, and then as labor was tightened through these immigration policies, we found that our cities, our manufacturing centers, were not finding the proper workforce. So the Great Migration filled this immigration gap. And the Great Migration is the largest domestic migration flow in U.S. history, where 6 million African Americans migrated from the South and moved into industrial cities like Detroit, Chicago, Pittsburgh, Baltimore, New York, even as far away as Los Angeles and San Francisco. So in order to meet the need for labor, the cities that cut off immigration were having a hard time making ends meet. So what we had was surplus labor in the South that was able to move up to the North. So this economic pull in the North really meshed nicely with the economic push because of lack of opportunity in the South. So between 1916 and 1970, we saw a lot of racial integration occurring in our cities. A lot of ethnic enclaves and racial enclaves began to evolve. Many of the patterns that we find in our cities today reflect this great migration from 1916 to 1970. And our final wave of immigration is where we are today. And this era is known as the ethnic kaleidoscope. So in 1965, there was another policy shift with immigration. It doesn't mean that everybody was on board with immigration, but there was some sentiment growing that areas like Latin America and Asia were pretty much cut off, that we were eliminating parts of the world because we were still practicing this archaic 1890 census quota. So the Immigration Act of 1965, which was passed in part by momentum of the Kennedy administration, said that quotas are an embarrassment, that we shouldn't have national origin quotas. There are still limitations on immigration today that look at regional parts of the world, that look at skill sets, but we're not setting an 1890 census quota on a particular part of the world. So as a result of this Immigration Act, we saw a flood of immigrants starting to arrive in the United States from places like Mexico, Central America, South America, China, and Africa, all highlighted here with arrows. So the image of our immigrants started to change from a European immigrant to really immigrants coming from all over the world, particularly from Latin America and Asia. And as a result of this wave of immigration, we've become a much more diverse society. When we look at the racial and ethnic minorities that are comprising our population today, we're seeing that in 1990, about a quarter of our population would fall into a racial or ethnic minority. In 2015, we were at 38%. So we see how this current wave of immigration continues to change the diversity and continues to change the makeup of our population. By 2050, it's believed that the United States is going to be what's called a majority-minority country, and that no single racial or ethnic group will make up 50% of the population. So while we see this increased diversity occurring in the United States today, much like groups coming from what's considered the outside in the 1800s, we still see some fear, we still see some xenophobia in our attitudes in the country today. We still see some tension as groups that look, act, behave, speak differently than us enter the United States. When we look at a chart of where people were born coming into the United States today, we see that there's a break, no data, which coincides with our immigration laws, which coincides with the Great Depression and World War II. And then we see coming out of the 60s how Latin America and Asia are really driving this immigration force today, are really the source regions for our migration pathways. And we see here, as our foreign-born population continues to grow, it's coming primarily from Asia and Latin America. So we'll wrap up by looking at immigration and the cultural landscape. Remember, the Marcus article introduces us to this idea of transnational landscapes, cultural landscapes that are recreated by the synthesis of multiple immigrant and migrant groups coming together. The image on this slide shows us all of the different neighborhoods that are found in Los Angeles. And all these neighborhoods reflect different migration streams. Little Ethiopia, Little Lithuania, Persian Square, Thai Town tell us a lot about the groups that are coming and recreating, transforming, reimagining these spaces within the city. Some of our older waves are reflected closer to home in Baltimore, where this area on the left in the black and white photo is known as Corned Beef Row. This is Lombard Street, just east of downtown. We can see a large synagogue. So we can see on the left side how a lot of these businesses were opened up by Jewish immigrants. We could see Hebrew signage. We could see the presence, the importance of religion in this neighborhood. Chinatown in New York City, one of the most identifiable ethnic enclaves in the United States. Chinatown, LA, very different, very far away, but still reflects that transnational makeup of Chinese immigrants arriving in LA. Persian Square. You can see here that Persian Square has such a large Iranian population that a phone book is actually produced to meet the needs of that local population. Boyle Heights, large Mexican-American population. Echo Park, also a large Latino population. Koreatown, one of what are called an economic enclave, meaning it's a cultural and economic district. So businesses here are owned and operated by Korean immigrants and first and second generation Koreans. Little Ethiopia grew in the 1970s and 80s as drought and political instability drove people from Ethiopia. So the little girl here standing next to the parking meter, you'll notice that the parking meter is decorated with Ethiopian colors. Little Havana in Miami represents that Cuban presence, that Cuban influence that is so strong in this part of the United States. That migration stream from Cuba, just about 100 miles or so into Miami. Very, very strong migration pathway. And Baltimore. Baltimore reflects both Greek migration streams and also Highlandtown, which today reflects refugees and generations of migrants.